Very good morning or very good afternoon, everybody. This applause was for our three speakers on this very panel. Welcome to the session devoted to two types of bad guys, so criminals and terrorists, which we will talk about with three great guys. But I'll just humbly introduce myself first, and then we'll move on to our stellar speakers. Kacper Rekawek, the Chief of Defense and Security Program at GLOBSEC, and I'm joined on stage by Maksud Kruse, who is the Executive Director of the Hedaya Center in the United Arab Emirates, which is the place to go to if you're looking for advice on countering violent extremism. Then Nick Rasmussen, who recently stepped down from being the boss of the NCTC in the United States, and NCTC stands for the National Counterterrorism Center in the United States. And Nick has spent more than 25 years in a government career which spanned State Department and NSC as well. And finally, last but not least, Magnus Ranstorp, who is, well, I'll say this, very few people could say that they are terrorism experts before 9/11. And Magnus is one of the this is a rare species, so to speak. And Magnus, thanks for being with us today as also a quality manager at Radicalization Awareness Network Center, EU Center of Excellence. Ladies and gentlemen, I was told to tell you this, but apparently you know this. We will be running polls during this very panel. This is a panel which will go for around for an hour. And go to slido.com, and there's an event code, and this is GLOBSEC 2018, and you are in Danube space, and I urge you to go to it, as we are actually running a poll right now. The question which we have for you before we actually start, and of course, please do help us answering this question, is which is the most probable scenario in Europe? And you have the four answers possible out there. Please choose one, and we will get back to you later on throughout the poll. And I will not hide it from you that the speakers will also be looking at similar issues, but do not take their cues from them. You do your thing, the speakers do their thing. So we'll take it from them. So gentlemen, thanks again for being with us. I think we have to admit that bad guys transfix us. And this session is about, as I mentioned, the two types of bad guys, who often are actually one type, or they come together, or they cooperate. Sometimes they like one another. One picks cues from the other. And I would be interested to know, how do you see that? Because we have a fantastic lineup of people with different experiences and different backgrounds coming from three continents. How would you see that in throughout your research, throughout your careers, throughout your service? What's the one example, or maybe more, of an individual who is in your memory, almost close to your heart, who went from one milieu to the other, whom we can use as an example of this crime-terror nexus that people quite often talk about? And if you allow me, Max, the floor is yours first, then we go to Nick and Magnus.
Well, thank you very much, Kacper. It's a great honor to be here, and it's the first time I ever come to this wonderful city. Frankly speaking, this topic is about a very bizarre phenomena where we see the forces of evil actually unite, collide, and work together in a very bizarre way. One phenomena within criminology is what we call deviant creativity, where criminals, equally terrorists, actually work in a very innovative, creative ways, how they can actually build their own criminal activities in the most bizarre ways. For example, when we look at this phenomena, we realize that sometimes they borrow from each other certain tactics, certain views, certain ways of doing things. When we look at gangstership, for example, the in-group, out-group dynamics, also the ways they work together in this regard. Therefore, this topic, for my perspective, is something that is very important and something that we need to shed some light on.
Thank you, Max. Over to Nick.
I would probably start by arguing that the experience we have in the United States may not match up exactly one for one with what our colleagues in Europe are seeing in terms of obvious connections between terrorist networks and criminal networks. Most of the individuals who've carried out terrorist attacks inside the United States, who we've kind of broadly grouped under the heading HVEs, homegrown violent extremists, these individuals tend to operate either alone or in relatively small groups. They tend not to have distinct network connections either to terrorist networks like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but also not to organized criminal networks inside the United States. Their nexus to crime largely comes through personal behavior. They may have engaged in petty crime during the course of their teen years or in their early 20s. They may have had various run-ins with the law, tending not to be necessarily serious crimes, but enough to have brought them into contact with law enforcement. But you wouldn't call them somehow nexus or tied by direct connection to organized criminal activity. In part, that's because they don't need that connection to organized criminal activity to gain the tools they need to carry out their horrible terrorist acts. One of the things I think that differentiates Europe is firearms are harder to get. Therefore, an individual who may want to carry out a terrorist attack may have to tap into a criminal network in order to gain access to firearms or something like that. Sadly, that's not the case in the United States. The ready availability of firearms means that you don't have to go off book to get access to an automatic weapon to carry out an attack. And if I think about the most salient case in recent memory that I can think of that illustrates this paradigm, it's Ahmed Rahimi, the individual who carried out a series of bombings in the New York, New Jersey area with pipe bombs a couple of years ago at a road race, a 10K road race in New Jersey, and then he migrated downtown to New York City and left in a couple of other pipe bombs in a downtown New York location. He had that classic background that I described, someone who had been in and out of trouble, but not in a way that ever got him put into jail for a long period of time. And it was things like domestic violence, petty crime, not what you would call, a true mobster or a mafioso or anything like that. So that's the American experience. I do recognize, though, that it does could be differentiated from what we may see in Europe. And of course, Magnus is well positioned to describe how it exists, how it's seen in Europe.
Thank you, Nick. And Magnus, we're still looking for the mobsters. Can you find some mobsters for us?
There are lots in Europe, I'm afraid. We see a huge convergence between crime and terror. I would say that they are indistinguishable, at least in the cases I've seen. It ranges, if you talk about the old groups like in Northern Ireland, there's a bedrock of smuggling activity, fuel and all sorts of racketeering, extortion. But you also look at the microfinancing of, for example, foreign terrorist fighters. One thing they are not lacking is money. And the money is generated from a whole array of different activity, everything from welfare benefit fraud to and this is my favorite, VAT fraud. They are really ingenious in terms of how they are using VAT fraud schemes. My favorite example is in Denmark, where you had a whole host of shell companies who were importing cheese and meat from Germany and Netherlands, and then they were connected to an ISIS cell in Melilla in Spain. And the extremists in Denmark gave the banking key facilitation devices so that they can lift money to fund people going from southern Melilla to Syria. I came yesterday from Copenhagen. A huge ring of criminals and extremists were arrested, and what they were doing essentially was that they were smuggling people. They were smuggling people into Europe. These were Syrians, and of course the money that they got from that was then smuggled back into Syria to fund the old Nusra Front.
Thank you, Magnus. Before we continue, maybe just to remind you, ladies and gentlemen, you can also ask questions on Slido. It's not only that we're running this poll for you, but you can also ask questions, which I'll then ask to our panelists. The poll is now back on the screen, I'm told, and we'll have the results. So actually, we're looking at 35% of our respondents actually were saying that organized crime groups and terrorist networks cooperate to transfer know-how and money, and both of the above, so the one that I've just read, and criminals who turn to terrorism use their skills to fund their terrorism activities. So there's an even split. So Magnus kind of reinforces the point, or the point you gentlemen were making, that there is, sometimes it's hard to distinguish between one another. But I wanted to push you on one front. This is a conference which is about modern things, about technology, and it's, you know, how it's being applied. And Maksud used the phrase deviant creativity. So I would like to push you a bit on innovation. When they actually do apply these schemes that Magnus just enumerated, when they think creatively. Have you seen throughout your careers and throughout your research, throughout your service, have you seen how creative and how innovative these guys are in the field of the intersection between criminality or terrorism? Or if not, maybe I'll start with Nick this time.
Sure. I guess in my experience, it's not so much that criminal networks and terrorist networks are making common cause with each other or working in alignment with each other, but they are very much operating like each other. They are adapting the same kinds of tactics. They're taking note of what each other of what other networks are doing, and they are learning lessons from that. So my colleagues in the FBI who follow organized crime, for example, have the same set of problems that we have in the counterterrorism world with encrypted technologies, the use of encrypted applications for communication. Obviously, it's very easy for a network to remain clandestine if they can utilize these technologies, and the same clandestine imperative is there for organized crime as it is for terror networks. So again, I don't see them necessarily lining up with each other, making common cause, but I see them operating in a very similar fashion. When they do intersect, my experience has been that it has tended to be more transactional. Magnus's point about the criminal networks helping move potential terrorists into Europe through human trafficking networks, that is something we've been very worried about in the United States. There have been occasional glimmers of intelligence that suggested that individuals tied to ISIS might come through the southern border of the United States through the human trafficking that goes on through the southern border. It hasn't necessarily materialized as a threat, but it is something that we were very, very attuned to, because the vulnerability is known to be there, and the criminal networks that exploit that vulnerability are there. So it stands to reason that at some point there will be a transactional relationship between terrorists and criminals seeking to exploit that vulnerability.
Thank you, Nick. We'll turn over to Magnus, because I wanted to push you on this. You were saying that you were looking at the old smuggling and you know, the good old IRA in this sense. And my question is, have you seen terrorists actually upgrading from smuggling pigs over border in Ireland, which was the old school type of criminal terrorist overlap, into something high-tech, something modern, to gain that kind of... You said VAT fraud. Mm-hmm. Can you think of other examples of behavior like that?
Oh, well, I mean, Northern Ireland, they're not particularly innovative because it's a tight environment, so they really don't innovate that much. I think it's mainly about invoice fraud. It's a massive, easy, goes together with VAT fraud. And we see a lot of different schemes in connection to that. They establish companies, they purchase things, then the company goes bust. And then they're off, and they maybe have positioned someone there to take the fall. All these types of schemes are happening every single day. So it's a massive thing. It is not as massive if I go outside of Europe to my favorite area, which is the tri-border area in Latin America. There you have everything. You have Chinese criminal syndicates, you have Russian organized crime, you have the Latin American, you know, drunks, gangs, and you have groups like Hezbollah and Iranians as well. And it's mainly a commercial activity. It's a lawless commercial activity, and the amounts that are coming out of that region is staggering. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars every week.
So Magnus, maybe on that point, I would like to take us outside of Europe again. Let's stay out of Europe. Maksud, over to you. From where you sit, and how you see this, how you see these flows, these schemes, the international overlaps. How do you see that?
Well, we can stay out of Europe, But terrorists, they are actually transcending, and they don't care about borders. Their existence in the digital world, the cybercrime, their ability to connect and reconnect and establish different associations is actually amazing. When we talk about the innovation approaches of these different terrorist groups, how they can fill the different gaps they have in terms of borrowing certain tactics, how they fund and finance their own operations and organizations. When we look at groups like Daesh, for example, their ability to mobilize, but also to control their sources of funding and being able to find markets in which are benefiting from their illegal activities. Therefore, to be very frank with you, the way they're operating, they're always finding these specific opportunities and windows in which they access and they connect and be able to build in their own approaches.
Thank you, Max. But I wanted to push you all gentlemen on this front. Magnus said transactional. That there's, you mentioned the transactional character of it. And the title of the panel is it good for business, bad for business? I wanted us to explore whether a classically ordinary decent criminals as they're called, and then not so decent terrorists, so to speak. Is this, if terrorism appears somewhere near a classically criminal syndicate or network, do they like that? Are they threatened? Is this a cliche to say they don't? What's the interaction? Where can the transaction happen? In what way? How does it happen? Even socially, so to speak, on a peer-to-peer level. I would be interested to hear your opinions on that.
I think we have some experience of criminal networks not wanting to become too close to cooperating with terror networks because they know that that may bring, if anything, more law enforcement scrutiny, more intrusive intelligence collection. The power of the state may be brought down more directly on your head if you're a criminal and you venture into ISIS-like activities. All of a sudden the state is a lot more interested in you. And so there is, in some ways, or in some environments, I would argue, a disincentive for criminal networks to become too closely attached to terror networks. That said, if there's money to be made, my guess is they will get over that.
Magnus?
I just want to come in on this point exactly. I mean, I think Molenbeek is a good example of that because the Belgian authorities really went in. They even went house to house to map out who do we have living here. So it's really bad for criminal business, at least for a while, until they may be filled again by bad guys.
A question from the audience, if I may, on this very point, because we're touching upon criminality intersection, but let's take a short break. But it touches upon this very issue. Stano here is asking, how much has recruitment of former criminals risen as a phenomenon now with ISIS compared to Al Qaeda? Or did it? Is redemption more present now than before? Maybe Max, over to you first. The issue of redemption. Do they really try to redeem themselves through all this, through being one type of a bad guy and then turning to being another type of a bad guy? I'm just wondering what would be your take.
It's about their creative ability to exploit, identify the weak points in their own victims and targets. So we've seen this even in Afghanistan with Taliban, where they basically build on the issue of guilt. Those who are vulnerable, who've committed so many sins in their lives, suddenly they are given a fantastic opportunity. You want to wipe all your sins out? Join us, blow up yourself, and you have a direct ticket to paradise. At the same time, understanding that their approach to recruitment is always based on what is their target audience, how they can actually know who they need to talk to, who they need to target, how they can attract, what kind of persuasion, but most importantly, what are the vulnerabilities in which they tap into, and then they bring their victims into their world.
And I would argue that thinking about the ISIS experience of the last 4 or 5 years has a little bit changed the model of recruitment that many of us had in mind for so much of the post-9/11 period. ISIS recruits across all of the different vectors that were mentioned, and the person they're looking to recruit doesn't necessarily have to be a particularly theologically sound person, somebody who brings a particular understanding of Islam to the table. The recruitment pitch that ISIS often brought to bring foreign fighters to the conflict zone had as much to do with adventure, had as much to do with violence, had as much to do with excitement and changing your life, bringing some animating purpose to your life, but it may not have been a theological purpose. And so, in a sense, it's not solely about religious redemption. It may just be about personal fulfillment in a way. Unfortunately, that meant that the pool of potential recruits was much wider than anything we had seen during the Al-Qaeda years. And I hesitate to think of the Al-Qaeda years as the good old days of dealing with counterterrorism, but it was a smaller pool of potential actors that we were coping with.
Nick, was it below, like beneath Al-Qaeda's honor and dignity to reach out to the criminal, let's say, section or recruitment?
Al-Qaeda operated more classically as a clandestine movement, so the barrier to entry was higher. There was a vetting process that went on. You had to somehow show not only your loyalty to the organization, but your fidelity to the kind of the core tenets of the organization. As we know from watching the foreign fighter experience over the last several years, and particularly here in Europe and across the Middle East, there was not a lot of vetting going on to bring people to the conflict zone to fight on behalf of the caliphate. It was whoever, whenever, however. And that differentiates this particular strain of extremist from I would argue, we saw when Al-Qaeda was the preeminent terrorist problem set.
Magnus?
No, I mean, I think ISIS would take anyone that could come. And in fact, about 75% of all the people who've gone down from Europe, and there's been between 5,000 to 7,000, 8,000 from Europe who've gone down to Syria and Iraq. Many of those individuals who went were recruited from within criminal elements. They were enmeshed locally, but it was usually the ones who didn't succeed as criminals who could get this redemption. And ISIS have this famous poster which says that even people with the worst past can make for the brightest futures. To give that redemption, or at least the illusion of that redemption, I think that they discovered when they came down there that the reality was very much different.
And that point, I think, is the important one in terms of the crime-terror nexus, at least as I've understood it about Europe. A significant percentage of the individuals who ended up being part of a terrorism investigation here in Europe were previously known to law enforcement through some criminal activity. And so that puts a greater burden on European states and their law enforcement authorities to be sharing that kind of information across borders in the way that we typically do with intelligence, but we don't always do with criminal intelligence. And so the individual who is arrested in a European capital for a terrorism offense may well have been involved in criminal activity somewhere else in the Schengen zone and be in somebody's database, but if that database, that identity information was never shared, that person might have been allowed to move freely across Europe in a way that threatens, safety and security here. And that's something I think that Europe is going to have to grapple with.
And I think a very important point is the issue of identity theft, because this is at the heart of this issue. Some governments did not have biometrics or very solid until very recently. You can go in and apply for passports without any interviews. So firming that up, having more biometrics, sharing that information among many different partners. Europol is doing a fantastic job in the criminal.
And we will get to Europol, and we will get to maybe not shaming, but naming the ones who do these things, counter these things well. And since we have no officials no serving officials on the stage, you were not getting away from that, gentlemen. But one question I wanted to bring in from the audience, Jaber is asking, ISIS is using techniques plundered from movies, video games, and news channels, and they use it to spread their message. What is the best way to counter it? So we're bringing in the bad guys element, the cinematic element, so to speak, to that very phenomenon. And it is, this let's play Call of Duty in real life. Don't play it in front of your computer screen, don't play it on your computer, you can play it with us for real. Maksud, how do you see that? Is this almost a cinematic phenomenon in this sense also?
Actually, the main problem is in the countering business. They send their messages, they decide on the platform, and we're always on the defense trying to catch up what they're trying to do and how they recruit. Obviously, they will use every single technology and every piece of creativity to reach to their target audience. In the ideal world, what we need to do is to present the alternative, is to be able to create the narrative, the message, in a way in which we decide on the timing and how it should be sent and also broadcasted. Most importantly also, they work in a very different environment in which for them everyone is a target. We've seen the recruitment of children, we've seen the recruitment of families, we've seen the recruitment of people who you wouldn't even think they will join such groups, and in fact that's where we're actually in a very awkward position. The real question is, however, why when they have their messages out there, why it attracts some of our youth and it doesn't? And those who are not attracted, we need to understand why they're resilient.
You know, there is a tendency in social sciences, you study something that happened, you don't study something that did not happen. Therefore, maybe we're also having this discussion that we're talking touches upon that point. Nick, from your perspective, the cinematic element.
You know, this is one of the most, as I now sit outside of government service, I look back and think this was one of the most frustrating elements of my period of government service, was our inability to generate effective counter-narrative content at scale and at the velocity you need to be able to counter what ISIS was doing. And I think we, a number of times inside the United States government, experimented with different organizational structures about trying to either delegitimize extremist content or put positive counter-narrative content online as a means of trying to speak to that same audience. And I would argue that our success was pretty minimal at you know, most of the metrics that you could look at would probably disappoint you in terms of the success. And I think one of the things we learned, the lesson we learned, is this really isn't in the main a governmental activity. It needs to be done by non-governmental organizations that don't carry the taint of being a law enforcement or intelligence organization that can speak more to that.
So in short, Nick, you're
that
saying
Call of Duty crowd
exactly.
isn't looking to the State Department website to be told what to think.
So in short, you're saying that you need Maxud and Magnus providing that kind of advice, and
ideally someone a lot younger and a lot hipper even than them.
Oh, I think they're pretty hip, I would say.
But if they're looking to websites that have .gov on the end of them for messaging, we're not going to get very far.
Magnus, over to you. A hip answer.
I think Maxud, you know, talked about we're always on the defensive, and therefore we have to be more innovative. And it struck me, working on this area, that we have a lot of creative people. We have a lot of creative people in advertising, people who don't know anything about ISIS, but they know how to deliver messages. And what ISIS has been so good at is to sort of drive in the issue of identity and belonging. And they've done so in very simple, very recognizable ways. The choreography has been very effective. And I think we need to work on that. And it really underlines and sort of exploiting the whole issue about integration in Europe and different value systems and how we bring people together in a more effective way. So you have to have a multi-layered way. You can't, I think you can't just put out messages. You also have to build multi-layered defenses, which may involve government, but I agree with you, it probably shouldn't be government doing that. But that includes interfaith dialogue, but more importantly, engagement among young people, and to narrow the pool of polarization within society. I mean, ironically, I mean, the right-wing extremists and these ISIS recruits or sympathizers are really hand in hand at the margins, and we have to sort of make sure that the middle ground doesn't go into either side. And there's a real danger in Europe today.
So it's the fight for the center, for the middle ground.
We have to be in the center, and I think we have to be much more innovative. I would encourage everyone who are creative, who are in industry, to really think hard of how can we shape alternative messages.
Maxud, you wanted to jump in on this?
Yes, I did. You were reading my mind, Casper.
I'm being told.
That's fantastic. In fact, when you map the experience of these violent extremists or terrorists or extremists, there are always three elements with multiple stages. First, what kind of ideas, thoughts that come through their mind as they go through the process of radicalization, and how these thoughts actually trigger emotional responses. How did they feel in each and every stage? And then we have the behavioral element. What did they do? What kind of actions? How they were performing in each and every level. Basically, by looking at all spectrums of extremism, right-wing, left-wing, or religious extremism, there are always certain underpinnings that we can see that are very, very similar. Perceived grievances, issues of identity, the notion that they need to have a certain purpose and mission and direction in their lives. When they join these groups, they actually tap into a world of excitement, action, endangerment, but most importantly, they feel they're having a noble cause, they're making a difference in the world, they're part of a group. If you take all of this away from them, the question remains, what is the alternative? What is it that you're offering them for them to come back to be part of the dynamics that you're looking for? And at the end of the day, we're talking about our generations, whether they're young or old. At the end of the day, they're tapping into a technology, into a certain way of communication that we haven't seen before. How we can be attractive, how can we have the level of influence? That is the question that we need to find an answer for.
Fantastic, Maksud. Thank you, gentlemen.
Can I jump in on that?
Yes,
point,
of course,
though,
Nick.
because as I was leaving government, one of the big pressing questions we were thinking about was, as ISIS was being so obviously and clearly defeated on the battlefield, the caliphate was shrinking. The idea of the caliphate certainly is not what it was at the point when it was as exciting a project as appears in ISIS social media. But the question for us was, will that factual reality actually change the degree to which the narrative still lands and creates that sense of belonging with individuals around the globe? And I don't think we know the answer to that yet. And I would be interested to know from my colleagues whether they see, they feel that ISIS has the ability to carry that narrative forward even in the absence of tangible success in building the project of the caliphate the way it was promised. That's gone, but the message still is there.
Thank you, Nick. We're bringing in the live audience, not just the electronic gizmo. There is a question right there, second row, almost in the middle. Thank you, sir. Keep it brief, please, if I may.
It's working? Yeah. Benedict van Hulsen, Oitop. I have a question for Mr. Ranstorp. I've heard the theory that the relative lack of terrorist attacks in Italy is attributable to the mafia sort of keeping terrorist networks down because, as you said, they're bad for business. And I've wondered, what do you think about the theory, and if it is applicable to Eastern or Central Europe, that large, well-established criminal organizations keep down terrorist organizations and try to save their business through that?
Well, I think Italy have often expelled the problem, particularly preachers who have been problematic, who have not had citizenship. But the example I cited earlier, where we had a Swede Syrian who was caught in Copenhagen. He was a link between two cells, one in Sardinia and one in northern Italy. I think sort of disproves that there are criminal elements, but these are mainly criminal groups. There may be some extremist elements within them who divert some of the funding. But it's true that at least Italy is a bit of an anomaly. I don't know whether it is because of the organized crime dimension, but certainly in the rest of Europe you see, you see a very worrisome development that the security threat is still continuing. France, everywhere, and even in the Nordic sphere, we are seeing a very sharp security environment.
Nick, Maksud, do you want to jump on this one? Because I have a question that I would like to ask to all of you, because we're in a very specific region, which maybe does not prioritize this threat. I mean, it was being picked up in this question, and I'd like to follow up with something similar. Martina is asking, we are in Central Europe. What's the situation in this respect in this region? What are the linkages? And I mean, I know you're not experts on this region, but I was just wondering, from your careers, have you seen these phenomena travel through, flow through Central Eastern Europe? Many people call it Eastern Europe. We prefer Central, so I'll just make a compromise: Central Eastern Europe. Broadly, anything to the east and southeast of Germany, so to speak, and European. Nick is...
Here again, I would draw a distinction between the ISIS era and the more Al-Qaeda-centric era that we were living in up until a few years ago. And unfortunately, the way in which ISIS communicates with its potential audience of recruits around the world has led to in a sense, a democratization of the terrorism problem. It is to be found in far many more places with far many more countries involved than was certainly the case during the Al-Qaeda era. I think back to the period when Al-Qaeda was our principal terrorism concern in the United States. The set of European partners that we worked with truly intensively in an intelligence capacity, maybe 5 or 6. Obviously, our British colleagues through the Five Eyes arrangement, France, Germany, a handful of others. Now there is not a European intelligence service anywhere that we, the United States, aren't closely working with. And I would include in that Central Europe, Southern and Eastern Europe. And that would not have been the case when Al-Qaeda was the principal terrorism problem. So sadly, a lot of the Central European services have had to find themselves involved in the counterterrorism business in a way that they may not have wanted to be a few years ago, and they have to develop capacity to deal with that problem as well.
Nick, can I push you on that? Do you think they have developed this capacity?
I think it's...
to the extent you can tell us, of course.
I think it's not a one-size-fits-all answer. I think in some cases the limits on resources and capacity will make it difficult. This will never be the #1 problem for the services of Central Europe, but it is an important and an emerging problem. So the question is, can they develop the tools and the capabilities to respond to extremism in their midst? And where does that fit into their list of priorities as opposed to dealing with other threat conditions that they may face?
Magnus, you want to...
Well, I think the attacks in Burgas, was a different organization, illustrates that any country can be vulnerable to this global threat. I think that what we see is that they can exploit cracks in the financial system, but also in the movement of people that one should be conscious about. The region I think a lot about is the Balkans, and particularly the weapons in the Balkans that we need to focus in on, because that is fueling both the criminal and sometimes the terrorism dimension. But I think, on the whole, the European intelligence services have been very impressive in terms of being able to cooperate. We know who went to Syria. Many of them either died or have not come back. So, they are, it's been a sharp learning curve. But I'm afraid the threat is not over yet. It's too early just to focus in on what's happening in Syria and Iraq. I mean, I'm thinking here about they're focusing in on Indonesia, on Afghanistan, trying to make their way back to Central Asia. Sweden had a reminder that the threat did not just come from maybe the Middle East or the Arab world, but rather from Central Asia. We had a terrorist who drove a truck through the main shopping street in Sweden. So I mean, I think that this is here to stay, and we have to build on the lessons that and the cooperation structures that we have built following 9/11, but certainly also following ISIS.
There are actually 3 reflections I'd like to share with you in relation to this specific topic. First, we need to realize that there are the threats of the homegrown, the lone wolves. Those are operate on their own, although they were living here in Europe and elsewhere. Therefore, that is an ongoing challenge. The second reflection is the type of extremism and or terrorism that we're looking at. So it's not the usual religious extremism only, but we're looking at certain aspects of right-wing extremism and different approaches of how we look at this and what it means in the long run in terms of the ongoing exchanges and dynamics. The third and the final reflection is basically when we look at Daesh specifically and how they operate. Originally, they had their own fantastic journal called Dabq, and Dabq refers to a city in Syria that is related to the end-of-day scenario which they were actually promoting and endorsing. Now that they're defeated on the ground, at least to a certain extent, they've changed the title from Dabq to Rumiyya, and Rumiyya is the ancient Arabic word of Rome, meaning Europe, which means the message, the direction has changed, where they encourage certain operations happening locally. And the last 3 years we've seen across Europe different incidences where they were carried by certain operatives, all happening in Europe, using different types of tactics, like basically using simple knives or driving with your cars. Basically, they will use anything at anyone at any time. Therefore, the type of challenge is actually changing. And related to what Magnus actually mentioned, as Daesh being defeated on the ground, we've seen they started to relocate themselves in different places. So there are allegiances for them in Libya and certain parts in Africa, but also they're going to Southeast Asia and southern Philippines, where they're trying to find for themselves a new place, a new hold. In other words, although we're seeing the change and the evolution, but the mutation of extremism and terrorism will continue, and we need to continue to develop new initiatives, new ways of looking at this, and how we can safeguard, protect, and most importantly, create the resilience and the prevention that we need.
Thank you for that, Maksud. I'd like to bring in the audience. I have 2 questions from the audience who kind of are anonymous, but not because the audience give their names to the questions. David is asking, are we missing something, essentially? That's how I understand the question. What criminal organizations do you consider as one of the least known, yet it is the one which is influential and dangerous? And I would just add, could morph into the terrorist business. Are we missing some elephant in the room, so to speak, gentlemen? Is there anything we're not looking at this very moment that probably in a few years' time we will regret from a counter-terrorism, counter-criminality, organized crime perspective?
I think you're asking us to identify if we know the unknown. And frankly, we always talk about good practices, not best practices, with the hope that the best is yet to come. This is an ongoing learning process for all of us. The phenomena is mutating, changing, and they always come up with new labels, new dynamics, and new processes. The real question is the following. It's not what we are missing at the moment, but how much we are doing with what we actually know. As we now talk about the nexus between these interesting phenomena, how much processes, policies, procedures, steps are being taken in the right direction? Another question, now that we know, and we've seen this in many incidences happening in Europe, that the majority of the people who committed these atrocities had their name, their record somewhere in some criminal database, but why we did not identify it? How did we miss this opportunity to intervene? And if we think that terrorists today, they're also tapping into the pool of criminals, who are the criminals that are more vulnerable to join terrorist groups or don't? Actually, in certain dynamics, we've seen that even some honest, clean criminals would distance themselves from terrorism, and also they have the different hierarchy and the different caps that they wear when it comes to what kind of a thug are you? Are you the one that actually commits certain atrocities or not? Are you part of the noble criminal activity or not? At the end of the day, they're all criminals, but they're not operating in the same way.
Magnus and Nick, do you want to jump in on the unknown unknowns?
You know, it's impossible to know what you don't know. And so all you can do, and I think this is where Europe is to be commended, is try in an incremental way to build capacity, to try to increase patterns of cooperation across national lines and across law enforcement and intelligence lines, which traditionally have proven to be stovepipes, not open areas of cooperation, and put yourself in a better position to deal with whatever challenge might emerge in the years ahead. I agree with Magnus. This is not a problem that is going to go away. It will look different 5 years from now than it looks today. And so the prudent set of things to do is not to build an architecture that's aimed at solving any one problem, but instead build an architecture that allows for a better and more free-flowing exchange of information between, as I said, law enforcement and intelligence and across national borders. And that's what Europe has embarked upon. It will not happen quickly. It is not something where you can simply have 1 or 2 meetings in Brussels and all of a sudden it works. Even inside the United States, changing our own systems to be able to share information more effectively on a national basis took us well over a decade in the aftermath of 9/11, and we even aren't where we want to be in our own information sharing practices. So I would urge patience and persistence on my European colleagues. I think many of you have the right vision in mind, but it will take some time to get there.
Agnes?
Well, I think, Nick, your agency and the Terrorism Intelligence Fusion Center is the way to go. Some countries have developed that in order to overcome the stovepiped nature of but I think counterterrorism is such an area, but also countering organized crime and criminal activity. And in the absence sometimes of legislation, I'm thinking here of my own country, Sweden, we have not had many convictions. We have had 150 out of 300 who've come back. But there are other ways you can deal with this issue. The tax authority have been doing Al Capone searches on suspects, and that has yielded 70–80% success. So it's always sort of pushing, not being defensive, but pushing the realm and envelope. And I think I have to say, yes, the picture looks bleak, but the cooperative structures look good. When you work on this business a long time, I have to say I'm impressed with what the intelligence service can do when they leverage, and also the partnerships, not just within Europe, but also across into different areas, working both on the ideological piece, but also on individual conflict zones and individual sets of terror cells.
So, Magnus, you're essentially saying that it's not only the bad guys who talk, it's the good guys who have found ways. It's a very uplifting picture, which sometimes probably gets lost in the public messaging, I guess. I think,
but also let me say one thing really key, because to be engaged in organized crime and criminal structures or ventures really requires identities. And if you can make it as difficult as possible through biometrics, through sharing this data, given also, of course, all the data protection rules that has to be there.
Exactly.
You have to balance that. But I think it will make it more difficult. Of course, on the flip side, you have new technology that's coming up. I mean, for example, virtual currencies and all these other nefarious ways you can use technology for both good and for bad.
And that you mentioned technology. Okay, yes, Max.
Sorry, Casper, but just we need to also remind ourselves that only relying on security, policing, intelligence, military approaches alone is no longer enough nor efficient. If we are truly sincere in countering this phenomena, we're all part of the solution. We're all part of the processes that if they are in place, we can see the differences that we're looking for. At the same time, we can't ignore the fact that we need a community engagement. We need some sort of leadership, credible voices, but also civil society, NGOs. They're all part of the process, not only in how we can handle this, but also how to prevent and protect in the longer run.
Yeah, it's an incredibly important point. I mean, inside the United States, if you look back at most of the recent terror incidents we've had, these have been individuals who were not under investigation by FBI. FBI, as good as the FBI is, they simply hadn't come to our attention in a terrorism-related way. They may have been, as I said, on our radar for petty crime or something like that. So the answer to identifying those individuals before they carry out some horrible act is exactly as Maksud said, community involvement, community engagement. In easily 80% of the cases that we've looked at over the last decade in the United States, somebody in the aftermath of that case lifted their hand and said, "Ooh, I actually saw something and I didn't really act on it in a timely way." That person might have been a teacher or a relative or a peer or a coach or a colleague. And those are the individuals who are the most likely to spot the signs of radicalization. And as Director Comey of the FBI used to say when we were testifying together on Capitol Hill, if I'm involved, if the FBI is involved, it's way too late already, because that person has probably already crossed several lines in terms of criminal activity, and they're going to go to jail somehow. The much more hopeful solution is to identify those individuals when they've been exposed to extremist material and ideology but haven't chosen to act on it yet. And if you can off-ramp them through some form of community engagement, get them off of that path, then that's a far, far preferable solution.
Magnus, over to you.
Very
briefly,
quickly,
if I may. Yes.
very quickly. This problem is often seen in hotspots. So all the foreign fighters from Sweden, 300, they came from 4 cities. In Germany, there were 13 cities with 10 or more foreign fighters out of the 900. So, we know where they are. We know that there's a sort of nexus between socioeconomic deprivation that creates a lot of social problems and ideology, because we also have to understand that this is an ecosystem. There are hate preachers, there are takfiri hate preachers that are out there, there are logisticians, there are those who facilitate individuals into these groups, and those, I can assure you, most of the law enforcement intelligence are marking.
Thank you, Magnus. I'll bring in one question from Slido, if I may, and then one question from the audience. Maybe the Slido one first, if I may. Victor is asking, we've done the cinematic, let's do the social media for a second, if we may. As more ISIS content is being taken down from social media, what do you predict will be, or already is, the new platform?
If I may say, a
Maksutov.
few years ago I was attending a meeting at the New York University, and a gentleman from the FBI was sitting there and talking about how the mobile phone is becoming a weapon, and talking about the recruitment, the propaganda, and all the things that are happening. And he immediately took his mobile and showed it up there and showing us how we need to do something about these websites. And what I did, actually, I picked the pen on the table when my time came to speak, and I said, sir, with all due respect, I'll be shoving this pen in your eyes. Let's ban all pens on the planet. The idea is that technology, platforms, mediums for communication, they are for the advancement of our work, of our humanity, not necessarily how we can do things. The real question is this: why, when the message is out there, regardless of the platform, it influences some of us but doesn't influence others? Why the message itself is so powerful, resonates with some of us but doesn't resonate with others? How someone would be convinced that they're willing to basically convert to a religion they have nothing to do with, smuggle themselves to the conflict areas, and then kill total strangers they never met before, and they end up by blowing up themselves? The question is, this entire process is based on the power of the message. Exactly.
Nick and Magnus, you want to jump on this point?
I guess that what I would say is that over the last several years, I think we in the United States have tried to do a better job of making the technology sector, the private sector that engaged in technology production, more of a partner in the countering extremism effort. It is not a natural partnership. Anytime you have the private sector working with the government, there are natural barriers to full and effective cooperation. But I think we've reached a point now in dealing with the technology sector that they are interested in keeping bad guys off of their platforms. They don't want that business. And they are interested in trying to be more effective at monitoring their platforms so that they can succeed in the first objective. That is, I think, a pretty stark contrast to a few years ago, when the reaction you got in most cases was, well, what do you want us to do about this problem? Now they are accepting responsibility. Now, it is still very difficult in many cases, technologically, to be able to, in real time, identify content and to take it down. And it is also a never-ending process that won't ever succeed in stopping the flow of material online that leads to recruitment. But it is a start, and I would argue that we're far better in this space than we were 3 or 4 years ago.
Magnus, over to you. Avid user of social media, I know.
Yes, they're both positive and negative sides. I mean, it's good that they don't make it difficult for their platforms, but of course it goes into different spheres, and of course it doesn't make it available to so many young people who may not know anything about this issue. But on the flip side, it also, during the time when ISIS was pushing out, you can actually see on Facebook profiles and so on who you should target if you're an intelligence service or a law enforcement. So in other words, it makes the life a little bit more difficult for the intelligence services who have to use informants, but also have to use signals intelligence. And so I think it's a good start where we are now, but we also need to work on other platforms, because the internet in and of itself does not radicalize most people. It can accelerate it. But we need to work on the more macro issues, and also target the key individuals who are particularly I'm speaking here in Europe, who we know who they are, they're facilitating this. No, these are the key nodes who are sort of fusing the networks together. If you target them with the tax authority, if you target them with the police efforts, make it difficult, make them on the defensive. It's at least a start.
A good recommendation, Magnus. I'd like to bring in the audience. There is a question right here.
Good morning. I'm Renier Bergema. I serve as...
Very brief, please, if I may. Apologies.
All right. Quick question. We've in the past hour, we've portrayed the crime-terror nexus as the former, more or less feeding into the latter. Yet in the Netherlands in 2016, we've seen decapitation being used by a criminal network to kill one of their drug runners. And with the potential influx of returnees, this may pose a serious risk, even though it's not necessarily ideological. Do you think there's enough attention for the reverse effect of the crime-terror nexus? And to what extent is it part of our de-radicalization and disengagement efforts?
I'll be looking for brief answers. Thank you for the kind of 30-second type of answers.
It's very simple. They borrow from each other, they inspire each other, and they continue, unfortunately, to learn the evil ways of how they can still do what they need to do. Let's all remember that at the end of the day, they're all anti-social, anti-law order. They all see themselves that they're above and beyond order. Therefore, all mechanisms or methods that they can borrow and learn from each other are actually required. Having said that, though, we still don't fully understand how this nexus actually works, in which direction, to what degree, and how much we still need to do for us to prevent, stop, identify, and most importantly, intervene.
Nick
Nothing
says
to add.
no. Magnus,
No, I mean,
really quickly.
Very quickly. I mean, I think on a different issue, I think we have to focus in on the financial intelligence that's yielded. I think in some countries there's not enough focus on that issue. We did a study on foreign terrorist fighters, how they funded themselves, and they were funding themselves all through different means. And we went to different governments and we asked them, what is your picture? And they said, well, it's not that strong. They don't do a lot of terror finance. We can't see that there are a lot of different schemes. So we haven't had really sort of we haven't gathered enough focus, I think, on the terror finance issue that it deserves.
Thank you, Magnus. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank our panelists. Apologies that we couldn't get to all of your questions. We brought in quite a few, I still hope. I would like you to later on join me in a round of applause for our speakers, and I know that there are refreshments available just inside the hotel, and please be back in this room in half an hour at 12:30 for the last session on Ukraine's complicated relationship with the rest of Europe. At 12:30, also at the same time in Maria Theresia upstairs, the subject is truth and the web. So finishing on this very big topics especially, I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists, and I wish you a great rest of our conference.
Thank you.